He had sung to thousands of crying fans before. That was normal. Women fainted at his concerts. Women screamed his name until their voices gave out. Women wept just from being in the same building as him. Elvis Presley had seen every kind of tear a fan could cry, and by the 1970s, he barely noticed it anymore. But this time was different. This time, the crying wasn't happening in a crowd of thousands screaming his name. It was happening in a quiet moment up close, where he could actually see her face. And something about the way this one woman cried made him stop everything he was doing and ask a question he almost never asked. "Why are you crying?" He expected the usual answer. "Because I love you. Because I can't believe I'm this close to you. Because this is the best night of my life." That is not what she said. What she told him instead hit him somewhere no fan had ever reached before. And people who were standing close enough to hear it said they watched something change in his face in real time. Like a curtain had been pulled back on a part of himself he usually kept hidden from the world. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what she said, why it affected him so deeply, and what it reveals about the loneliest parts of being the most famous man on earth. Stick around, because this story says more about who Elvis really was than almost anything that happened on a stage. Before we get into it, if you're the kind of person who loves these deep dives into the real human side of Elvis, the stuff that never made the highlight reels, hit subscribe now. We put these out regularly, and trust me, you don't want to miss the next one. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to understand something most people get wrong about Elvis Presley. The public saw a legend, gold suits, hip shakes, screaming stadiums, a voice that could turn a love song into a prayer and a gospel song into a party. To millions of people around the world, Elvis wasn't really a person. He was an idea, a symbol of something bigger than any one human being could ever be. But behind the rhinestones was a man who grew up with almost nothing in Tupelo, Mississippi. A man who watched his family move from one rundown home to another. A man who lost his twin brother, Jesse, at birth, and who grew up being told by his mother that he was living for two people, not one. That kind of weight doesn't just disappear because you become famous. If anything, it gets heavier. By the time Elvis was filling arenas, he had already lived several lifetimes. He'd been a truck driver. He'd been laughed at for how he dressed. He'd been a soldier stationed in Germany, missing his mother so badly that friends said he cried himself to sleep some nights. He'd buried that same mother, Gladys, in 1958, and those who knew him best say he was never quite the same afterward. So when people talk about Elvis the icon, they're only telling half the story. The other half is a man who felt everything a little too deeply. A man who could be generous to the point of giving away cars to total strangers, who could sit at a piano at 3 in the morning singing gospel songs until his voice cracked, who could look out into a sea of thousands of screaming fans and still, somehow, feel completely alone. That contradiction, adored by millions, understood by almost no one, is the key to this whole story. Because fans loved Elvis, but very few of them ever really saw him. Most people who came face to face with him were so overwhelmed by being near a legend that they never had room left over to actually connect with the man standing in front of them. This woman was different, and that's exactly why her answer cut so deep. Think for a second about what it must be like to have literally millions of people love an idea of you. Think about growing up so poor that your family sometimes didn't know where the next meal was coming from, and then, within just a few short years, becoming so famous that you can't walk into a restaurant, a store, or even your own front yard without being swarmed. That kind of transformation doesn't come with an instruction manual. There was no support system built for a level of fame like Elvis experienced, because frankly, almost nobody in human history had experienced fame quite like his before. He was one of the first true global superstars of the television and recording age, and he was, in many ways, figuring out how to survive it in real time, with the whole world watching. And through all of that, the boy from Tupelo never really left him. Friends and family members who knew him throughout his life often said the same thing in different ways. That underneath the fame, underneath the money, underneath the legend, Elvis remained, at his core, a deeply sentimental, almost fragile person who wanted very badly to be liked, to be understood, and to make the people around him happy. He wasn't the swaggering, untouchable rock star that some corners of pop culture like to remember. He cried at movies. He cried during gospel songs. He gave away cars, jewelry, even homes to people he barely knew because seeing someone else happy seemed to genuinely fill something up inside him. That emotional openness is part of what makes this particular story about the crying fan so believable and so consistent with everything else we know about him. This wasn't a cold, detached superstar going through the motions of concern for the cameras. This was a man who, by every account of the people who actually spent time with him, felt things intensely, sometimes almost too intensely for someone whose life was under constant public scrutiny. By the mid-1970s, Elvis's life had settled into an exhausting rhythm. Long stretches in Las Vegas, grueling national tour. 2 shows a night sometimes in cities that blurred together after a while. The schedule was punishing, and those closest to him, his band, his backup singers, the Memphis Mafia who traveled everywhere with him, could see the toll it was taking. He wasn't the lean 21-year-old who had shocked television audiences on the Ed Sullivan Show anymore. He was older now, heavier some nights, thinner others, his health quietly unraveling in ways the public wasn't fully allowed to see. But when the lights came up and the band hit that opening fanfare, something in him still switched on. He still gave people a show. Even on nights when he was exhausted, even on nights when his body was clearly struggling, Elvis still walked out and gave the crowd everything he had left. That's the version of Elvis who was on stage the night this story happened. Not the young rebel from the 50s, not the leather-clad comeback king from 1968. A tired, aging superstar who was still, somehow, pouring his whole heart into every single show because that's what he believed his fans deserved. The venue was packed like it always was. Rows and rows of people who had saved up money, driven for hours, worn their best clothes just for a chance to be in the same room as him. Somewhere in that crowd, close enough to the stage that he could actually make out individual faces under the lights, was a woman who could not stop crying. At first, nobody thought much of it. Crying fans weren't unusual. Elvis had been making women cry since before some of the people in that room had been born. Ushers were used to it. Security was used to it. Even Elvis himself, most nights, could clock a crying fan out of the corner of his eye and keep right on singing without breaking stride. But this woman's crying wasn't the excited, overwhelmed kind he was used to seeing. It was heavier than that. It didn't ease up between songs the way it usually did with fans who just needed a minute to catch their breath. It kept going, song after song, and something about it kept pulling his eyes back to her, over and over, even while he was singing to 10,000 other people at the same time. You have to picture the scale of what he was working with in a moment like that. Stage lighting in a venue that size is disorienting. Performers often describe seeing very little of the actual crowd beyond the first several rows, with everything beyond that dissolving into a wall of shifting light and shadow. So the fact that he kept noticing her, kept being pulled back to her face again and again, says something about how distinct her reaction must have looked compared to everyone around her. Most of the crowd that night was doing exactly what crowds at Elvis shows always did, singing along, reaching toward the stage, snapping photos on cameras that would take days to develop, holding up signs they'd made at home. It was a wall of joy, noise, and adoration, the kind of atmosphere Elvis had spent nearly 2 decades learning to read and respond to instinctively. Against that backdrop, one woman quietly falling apart in her seat would have stood out precisely because it didn't match the energy around her. She wasn't cheering between sobs. She wasn't holding up a sign. She wasn't reaching for him the way so many fans did, desperate for a touch, a wink, a moment of eye contact to hold on to forever. She was simply sitting there, overwhelmed by something that had nothing to do with excitement and everything to do with what she was seeing in his face. There's a thing performers develop after enough years on stage, a kind of radar for the crowd. Elvis had that radar sharpened to an almost supernatural degree. He could read a room the way other people read a book. He knew when energy was dropping. He knew when to slow a set down and when to speed it up. He knew most of the time exactly what his audience needed from him before they knew it themselves. And that same instinct was what told him, that night, that something about this particular woman wasn't right. Between songs, while the band shifted into the next arrangement, he reportedly paused. He looked out at her directly, not the vague, sweeping gaze he usually gave the crowd, but a real, locked-in look. And then he did something he rarely did in the middle of a show. He stopped. He asked the band to hold. He walked closer to the edge of the stage, closer to where she was sitting, and in front of everyone in that room, he asked her the question that would end up meaning so much more than either of them expected. "Why are you crying, honey?" It's a simple question. He'd probably asked some version of it 100 times over the years to 100 different overwhelmed fans, always expecting some version of the same sweet, predictable answer. This time, the woman didn't say what he expected. Through her tears in front of a room full of strangers, she told him something raw and honest, something that had nothing to do with being starstruck and everything to do with fear. She told him she wasn't crying because she was happy to see him. She was crying because she was scared for him. For a split second, imagine the whiplash of that moment from his side of the stage. He spent his entire adult life being told in 1,000 different ways that he is larger than life, untouchable, a king, the kind of man other men wanted to be and other women dreamed about. And here, in the middle of all that, a stranger looks him directly in the eye and tells him, essentially, I can see that you're not okay. There's no amount of applause that prepares a person for that. No number of sold-out arenas softens the blow of someone seeing straight through the performance to the exhaustion underneath. If anything, the contrast probably made it hit even harder, thousands of people around her cheering as loud as they could. And right in the middle of all that noise, one small, honest voice saying something completely different. According to those who were close enough to hear it, and according to the way this moment has been retold by fans and biographers ever since, her answer was something like this. She said she'd followed him for years, that she'd seen him in concert before, and that she could see how tired he looked, how much weight he was carrying, both literally and in his eyes. She told him she was scared he wasn't taking care of himself. Scared that the man everyone in that room was cheering for was quietly falling apart in front of them, and that most people were too busy celebrating him to notice. She wasn't crying because she loved Elvis Presley, the superstar. She was crying because she was worried about Elvis Presley, the human being. And that distinction, the difference between loving an image and caring about the actual man underneath it, is what reportedly stopped him cold. Think about what that must have felt like for him. Here was a man who spent almost every waking hour surrounded by people, his entourage, his band, his management, hotel staff, security, doctors, assistants, friends who depended on him for their livelihoods, thousands of fans who screamed his name every single night. And yet, by most accounts from people who actually knew him, Elvis Presley was one of the loneliest men in America. He was surrounded by people who needed things from him, wanted things from him, made money because of him. What he didn't have much of, especially in those later years, was people who simply worried about him the way you'd worry about someone you loved, with nothing to gain from it. This stranger, this fan he had never met before and would likely never see again, looked past the rhinestones and the spotlight and the roaring crowd and saw a tired man who needed someone to actually notice him. And for a moment, on a stage in front of thousands of people, that's exactly what happened. People who witnessed it say Elvis went quiet, that the easy, charming stage persona slipped just for a second and something more vulnerable showed through. He reportedly thanked her gently the way he thanked fans for gifts or letters, but there was something different in his voice this time. Less performance, more weight. And then, because that's what he always did, because the show had to go on and thousands of other people were still waiting, he pulled himself back together, smiled for the crowd, and kept singing. But those who were there say he wasn't quite the same for the rest of that show. Something about that woman's answer stayed with him. To understand why one fan's tears could hit a man used to adoring crowds so hard, you have to understand what was actually happening in Elvis's life around this time. By the mid-1970s, the pressures on him were enormous. His marriage to Priscilla had ended. He was raising his relationship with his daughter, Lisa Marie, mostly through visits rather than everyday life. His grueling performance schedule, set largely by his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, left him constantly on the road, constantly performing, rarely resting. Reports from people close to him describe growing health struggles behind the scenes, exhaustion, weight fluctuations, and a body that was carrying more strain than the public was allowed to see. And through all of it, the show never stopped, because Elvis Presley wasn't just a person anymore. He was an industry. Tickets had been sold. Hotels had been booked. Musicians, backup singers, security, and staff all depended on those tour dates happening on schedule. The machine around him needed him to keep performing night after night, city after city, regardless of how he was actually feeling underneath the suit. In that kind of environment, it becomes incredibly easy for the people around a famous person to stop seeing them as a human being with limits and start seeing them only as a resource, a product, a schedule to be maintained. Even people who loved him could get swept up in keeping the machine running instead of asking the harder question, is he okay? That's what makes this fan's reaction so remarkable. She wasn't part of his inner circle. She had no stake in whether the tour continued. She wasn't paid to worry about him. She was just a person in a crowd who looked closely enough to notice what a lot of people closer to him had apparently stopped noticing or were too afraid to say out loud. She saw exhaustion where others saw glamour. She saw a man who might be struggling where others saw an untouchable icon. And in a room full of people who wanted something from Elvis, an autograph, a photo, a moment to tell their friends about, she was one of the very few who simply wanted him to be all right. That's rare for anyone, let alone for someone as famous as Elvis. And it's exactly the kind of moment that can crack open the walls a famous person builds up just to survive being famous. It's also worth remembering just how young most of the people running his day-to-day life had become by this point. His management team, his inner circle, even a lot of the friends he surrounded himself with, had grown up inside the machine of Elvis Presley Enterprises, for so long that it's easy to imagine how normal his exhaustion might have started to look to them. When you see someone every single day, even significant changes can creep up on you slowly enough that you stop noticing them. It's the people who only see someone occasionally, a fan who catches a show once a year, once every few years, once in a lifetime, who sometimes notice the difference most sharply, because they're comparing him not to yesterday, but to the version of him fixed in their memory from years before. That may be part of what made this fan's reaction so visceral. She wasn't comparing him to how he looked the night before. She was comparing him to the Elvis she remembered from earlier in his career, maybe from a poster on her wall, maybe from an earlier concert years prior. And the gap between those two images, the young man from her memory and the tired man standing in front of her now, was wide enough to bring her to tears in an instant. This wasn't the only time in Elvis's life that a small, quiet moment of genuine human concern seemed to affect him more than the roar of an entire stadium. There are countless stories, some more documented than others, of Elvis's strange, almost childlike sensitivity when it came to kindness. Longtime friends and biographers have described him tearing up over letters from fans who wrote about hard times in their own lives, not fan letters gushing over him, but letters where strangers opened up about their own grief, their own struggles, their own losses. He related to pain. He recognized it in other people because he carried so much of it himself. There are also well-known stories about his generosity, famously buying Cadillacs for total strangers, on more than one occasion, simply because someone admired one in a dealership window. One of the most retold versions of this involves Elvis noticing a woman looking longingly at a car on a lot, and without hesitation, buying it for her on the spot. It wasn't really about the car. Those who knew him say it was about the look on someone's face when they realized somebody, anybody, had truly seen them and cared enough to act on it. That's the thread that connects all of these stories, including the one about the crying fan. Elvis Presley, despite being one of the most photographed, most celebrated, most idolized men of the 20th century, seemed to crave the exact same thing every ordinary person craves: to be seen not as an image, but as a person. To have someone notice not the performance, but the human being underneath it. Most of his fans, understandably, were too swept up in the magic of being near him to offer that. They came to see the king. They came to hear the voice that had defined generations. Very few of them thought to ask, in that overwhelming moment, whether the man in front of them was actually okay. This one woman did. Even through her own tears, even standing in the middle of a concert built entirely around celebrating him, she saw past the spectacle. And that's precisely why her answer stuck with him. She wasn't offering worship. She was offering worry. And to a man surrounded by people who often wanted something from him, someone worrying about him instead was almost jarring in how different it felt. There's a broader lesson buried in these stories, too, one that goes beyond Elvis and touches on how we treat anyone we admire from a distance. It's easy to reduce a famous person down to the role they play in our own lives. The singer whose songs got us through a breakup, the actor whose movie we watched 100 times, the performer whose concert we saved up for years to attend. In doing that, it becomes almost automatic to forget that there's a full, complicated, tired, sometimes struggling human being standing behind that role. Elvis's fans loved him fiercely, and that love was real and it mattered to him. But love expressed only as excitement, only as adoration, only as wanting something from him, an autograph, a scarf, a moment of his time, isn't quite the same as love that simply wants him to be well. This fan managed to offer both in the same breath. She loved him enough to be in that arena in the first place, to know his face well enough to notice subtle changes in it, to care enough about a stranger's well-being that she couldn't hold back tears. But what she gave him in that moment wasn't fan devotion. It was something closer to the kind of concern you'd expect from someone who actually knew him. And for a man who spent his life mostly surrounded by the former, receiving even a small taste of the latter, from a total stranger no less, seems to have meant something enormous. There's something almost unbearably sad about the idea that one of the most beloved entertainers who ever lived could go night after night surrounded by thousands of adoring fans and still feel like nobody was truly checking in on him. But if you look closely at Elvis's final years, that sadness runs through almost everything. Fame, especially fame at the scale Elvis experienced it, has a strange way of isolating a person even while surrounding them with more people than almost anyone else on earth will ever be around. Every interaction becomes filtered through what someone wants, needs, or hopes to get from you. Every relationship carries the invisible weight of your fame sitting in the middle of it. It becomes incredibly difficult to know who genuinely cares about you as a person and who is drawn to the idea of you. That's why a moment like this, a total stranger, crying not out of excitement but out of concern, could cut through all of that noise so completely. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't transactional. It was simply one human being looking at another and worrying about him. In hindsight, knowing what we know about how Elvis's story ended just a few years later, in August of 1977, moments like this take on an almost prophetic weight. The exhaustion this fan noticed in his face. The toll the schedule was clearly taking on his body. The quiet signs that something wasn't right, buried underneath the sequins and the spotlight, visible only to someone paying close enough attention to actually look. She saw it before most people were willing to admit it. And whether or not that specific night changed anything in the long run, it's hard not to wonder what might have been different if more people around him had asked the same question she did with the same honesty. Not, "How was the show?" Not, "Can I get a picture?" But simply, quietly, "Are you okay?" It's worth pausing here to say that this fan wasn't the only person in Elvis's orbit who seemed to notice the exhaustion hiding underneath the performance. If you look at the people who spent real time around him in his final years, a pattern starts to emerge. A quiet chorus of people who tried, in their own ways, to get him to slow down. His stepmother, Dee Presley, reportedly worried aloud about his weight and his stamina. Members of his band, some of whom had been with him since the beginning of his career, would exchange glances during shows when his breathing sounded labored or his energy dipped mid-set. Even Priscilla, years after their divorce, has spoken publicly about how concerned she became during their final conversations, about how different he seemed from the young soldier she'd fallen in love with in Germany. But here's the uncomfortable truth about fame at that level. Concern from people inside the circle can be easy to brush off. It can start to sound like nagging. It can start to sound like people trying to control the schedule, control the diet, control the image. Even well-meaning concern from people who are financially or professionally tied to you can feel complicated, tangled up in questions about motive. A stranger crying in the third row has no such complications. She wasn't on the payroll. She wasn't going to lose a job if the tour got canceled. She had absolutely nothing to gain by telling Elvis Presley, in front of a room full of people, that she was scared for him. Which is exactly why her words may have landed with a kind of clarity that concern from people closer to him simply couldn't match. Sometimes it takes an outsider, someone with zero stake in the outcome, to say the thing that everyone closer to a person is too afraid, too used to the routine, or too emotionally tangled up to say clearly. That's part of what made this moment so powerful. It wasn't just that someone was worried about him. It's that the person worried about him had absolutely nothing to gain from saying so out loud. There's another layer to this story worth sitting with, and it has to do with what it actually costs a person to perform, night after night, year after year, regardless of how they feel underneath. Anyone who has ever had a bad day at work and still had to put on a smile for customers knows a small, watered-down version of what Elvis lived with every single night of his touring life. Except his bad days were happening in front of thousands of people, under bright lights, with cameras sometimes rolling, with an entire industry of musicians, backup singers, security staff, and business partners depending on him showing up and delivering. Biographers and people who traveled with him during those years have described the toll this took. The late nights that bled into early mornings, the demanding schedule set largely by decisions made above his head. The way the show must go on wasn't just a saying for him, it was closer to a law of physics, an unbreakable rule that governed his entire existence. Whether he had slept, whether he felt well, whether his heart was breaking over something happening in his personal life. Performers who reach that level of fame often talk about a strange kind of split that happens inside them. There's the version of themselves the audience sees, polished, confident, larger than life. And there's the version that exists in the hours before and after the show, the version that has to be coaxed, sometimes with real difficulty, into becoming that other person again. For Elvis, by most accounts, that split had grown wider over the years. The young man who used to bound onto stage practically vibrating with excitement had, by the mid-70s, become someone who sometimes needed real effort just to get through the door of the venue. And yet, once the lights came up, something in him still answered the call. Something in him still gave the audience everything he had, even when there wasn't much left to give. That's the man this fan was looking at when she started crying. Not the polished image on the record's sleeve. The real, tired human being doing his absolute best to give a room full of strangers a night they'd never forget, even as his own body and spirit were quietly running on empty. It would be easy to hear a story like this and file it away as just another piece of Elvis trivia, another anecdote in the enormous pile of stories that exist about one of the most documented human beings of the 20th century. But there's a reason this particular kind of moment keeps getting passed down, told and retold by fans, referenced in books, brought up in documentaries and interviews decades later. It's because it captures something true about fame that most people never get to see up close. We tend to imagine that being adored by millions must feel wonderful all the time, an endless stream of love and admiration flowing toward you every single day. And in some ways, it is a privilege very few people will ever understand. But what stories like this one reveal is that adoration and understanding are not the same thing. You can be loved by an entire stadium and still feel like almost nobody in that building actually knows you. Elvis Presley's story, especially in its final years, is full of moments like that. Moments where the sheer scale of his fame seemed to work against him, insulating him from the kind of honest, unglamorous human connection that might have helped him more than another round of applause ever could. This crying fan, whoever she was, gave him a small piece of that honest connection, even if just for a minute or two in the middle of a show. And the fact that people who were there still remember it, still talk about it, still pass the story along all these years later, tells you something about how rare and how needed that moment really was. What makes this story worth telling isn't really about celebrity gossip or a dramatic backstage secret. It's about something much simpler and, honestly, much more human. Elvis Presley spent nearly his entire adult life being looked at. Millions of eyes, night after night, decade after decade. Cameras, screaming crowds, headlines. And yet in that sea of attention, genuine seeing was rare. There's a difference between being looked at and being understood, and Elvis, more than almost anyone in modern history, lived that difference every single day. This one fan, through her tears, gave him something most of the world around him couldn't. Not admiration, not excitement, just honest human concern offered without expecting anything back. And maybe that's the real reason this story has stuck around all these years later, passed down through fans and biographers, retold in interviews and books about his life. It's not really about Elvis the legend. It's about the brief moment when the legend disappeared and all that was left was a tired man, standing on a stage, being asked if he was okay by someone who genuinely wanted to know. He gave the world so much joy across his career, songs that are still played today, performances that shaped the entire course of American music, a voice that changed what people believed was possible in a recording studio. But underneath all of that, he was still just a person, carrying more weight than most of us will ever fully understand. That's what this story reminds us, not that Elvis was untouchable, that he was human all along, even when the whole world was too dazzled to notice. So the next time you watch old footage of Elvis on stage, smiling, sweating, giving everything he had to a crowd of strangers, remember this story. Remember that somewhere in that crowd, on more nights than we probably know about, there might have been someone quietly worried about the man behind the performance, even while everyone else around them was simply enjoying the show. If this story moved you the way it moved us putting it together, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. We're telling more of these real, human stories about Elvis's life every week, the parts of his story that never made it into the headlines, but that explain who he really was better than any hit song ever could. And if you've got a favorite Elvis moment or a story about him that always stuck with you, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and honestly, some of the best stories on this channel have come from things you all shared with me. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.